Welcome to the Explainer. So how do scientists get inside our heads, without crossing some serious lines? Today, we're going to dive into the critical ethical rules that protect people in research. It's all about this huge balancing act between finding amazing new insights and, well, the absolute duty to do no harm.
And to really get a grip on this, we've got to go back in time to one of the most famous and, honestly, most controversial experiments ever. This is the study that basically rewrote the rulebook for psychology.
All right, so picture this. It's the 1960s. A psychologist named Stanley Milgram is obsessed with one question: why do people obey authority? He sets up this experiment where you, a volunteer, the teacher, are told by a guy in a lab coat to give what you believe are real electric shocks to another person, the learner, every time they get a question wrong. And yeah, with every mistake, that voltage just keeps climbing. And the result was, well, it was shocking. The vast majority of people kept flipping those switches all the way to the maximum voltage, even while they could hear the learner screaming in what sounded like pure agony. Now, Milgram uncovered a really powerful and kind of disturbing truth about obedience, but the cost was immense. The people in the study were left with this crushing guilt and stress, thinking they had actually harmed another human being. This single experiment threw the entire field of psychology into an ethical crisis.
Okay, so after something like that, you have to ask, how do we make sure that never happens again, but without totally stopping science in its tracks? Well, the first big step was to create something like a safety commission for research. Think of it as a watchdog group whose entire purpose is to do this moral math, weighing the potential harm against the potential good.
And that group has a name, the Institutional Review Board, or IRB for short. It's not just a bunch of scientists either. It's made up of scientists, sure, but also non-scientists and even people from the local community, folks who have no personal stake in the research. They look at every single proposed study and basically boil it down to one critical question: is what we could learn here worth the risk to the people involved?
Now, to answer that big question, the IRB first has to figure out the level of risk. And they start with a baseline called minimal risk. So what does that mean? It basically means the harm or discomfort in the study is no bigger than what you might run into in your everyday life. Like the normal stress you might feel taking an exam in class.
So let's look at this. A basic memory test on a computer? That's pretty much classic minimal risk. But what about a study like Milgram's, where you're led to believe you're hurting someone? Yeah, that is way beyond everyday stress. That puts a participant in the at-risk category. And as soon as a study is labeled at risk, it gets put under a microscope and needs a whole lot more safety measures built in.
And here's something that's so important to get. Risk isn't just about getting physically hurt. Especially in psychology, the biggest dangers are often the ones you can't see. Yeah, researchers have to think about a whole spectrum of potential harm. There's social injury, like what if your private, maybe embarrassing answers got leaked? That could totally harm your reputation. And then, of course, there's psychological injury. That's the deep mental stress we saw in the Milgram study. The number one job for a researcher is to protect people from all of these things.
Okay, so we've got the IRB assessing risk, but there's another huge layer of protection. You can think of it like a social contract, an agreement between the person running the study and the person taking part in it.
And the heart of that contract is something called informed consent. This is basically the exact opposite of that tiny, impossible-to-read fine print you see on contracts. It's a crystal clear breakdown of what you're getting into so that when you say yes, it's a real yes, totally free and totally informed.
So what does that actually look like? It means they have to tell you what you'll be doing, what the risks and benefits are, and how they're going to protect your privacy. But honestly, the most important part? It's the escape hatch. They have to tell you right from the get-go that you can walk away at any time for any reason, and there will be absolutely no penalty. You are always in control.
Okay, but wait a minute. This brings up a really tricky problem, right? What happens when telling people everything about the study would completely ruin it? I mean, if you know what they're looking for, you might act differently, and then the results are useless.
And that brings us to the very controversial topic of deception, either not telling people the whole story or even actively misleading them. The case against it is pretty obvious. It's dishonest, right? It kind of breaks that trust we just talked about. But the argument for it is that sometimes you need what Milgram called a technical illusion to see how people really behave, not how they think they should behave.
So while an IRB might, after a ton of debate, approve a study with some mild deception, there are absolute hard limits.
The ethics code for psychologists is crystal clear on this. You can never deceive participants about research that is expected to cause physical pain or major emotional distress. That's a line you just don't cross. Ever.
And for those times when deception is used, it has to come with its ethical antidote, something called a debriefing. This is super important. It means after the experiment is done, the researcher sits down with you and comes completely clean. They explain the real purpose, why they had to use deception, and they make sure to deal with any bad feelings you might have. The goal is for you to walk away feeling good, understanding that you made a real contribution.
Now, this whole ethical framework doesn't just stop with the people in the studies. It's a much bigger commitment to integrity that runs through the entire scientific process.
For instance, it covers the humane treatment of animals in research. They have their own oversight committees, kind of like an IRB for animals. It also means researchers have an obligation to report their findings honestly. No fudging the numbers. And then there's the big one, plagiarism. Passing off someone else's ideas as your own? That's a major ethical sin in science.
So let's circle all the way back. With all these rules in place, the IRB, informed consent, limits on deception, could a study as controversial as Milgram's ever happen today?
And the answer, surprisingly, is yes. In 2009, a psychologist named Jerry Berger did an ethical replication of Milgram's study, but he built in a ton of modern safeguards. First, he carefully screened people to exclude anyone who might have a really bad reaction. He told them over and over that they could leave at any time. He even had a clinical psychologist right there, ready to stop the experiment for anyone showing too much stress. And here's the biggest change. He stopped the whole thing at 150 volts, which is the point where the learner first protests. That move alone prevented the extreme distress that made the original so problematic.
And the results? Wow. The obedience rates were only slightly lower than what Milgram found almost 50 years earlier. What Berger's work proved is absolutely critical. You can do important, even unsettling research, but you can do it while putting the health and safety of your participants first, always.
Because at the end of the day, these ethics rules aren't just about covering your bases or avoiding lawsuits. They're the very foundation of good science. When research is done to the highest ethical standard, we can trust the results. It's how science earns and keeps the public's trust.
So next time you see a headline about some amazing new psychological finding, remember everything that's going on behind the scenes. There's this constant, careful balancing act between our drive to learn more and our deep respect for the people who volunteer to help us. These ethical rules, they're the invisible scaffolding that allows us to safely discover what makes us tick.